Hi, good evening. I'm here tonight to talk about the Haldimand County water and wastewater rate study and financial plan that the county is currently undertaking. I'll talk a little bit about the study purpose, why are we doing this report and analysis, and then we'll talk a bit about the current rates, the current number of customers in the system, the volumes in the system, and then we'll talk a bit about how this customer profile is going to grow over the next 10 years. We'll talk about the capital needs and how we're going to finance those capital needs or how we propose to finance those capital needs. And then we'll talk about life cycle costs, which really relate to asset management planning. Then we'll talk about the proposed rates, the volume and the base charge rates for the water and the wastewater systems. And then we'll get into a summary of the special charges that the county imposes. Lastly, happy to answer any questions at the end. So the purpose of undertaking a water and wastewater rate study really is for the municipality to understand the costs and revenues anticipated over the next 10 years. And so what we do is we take a look at the current costs and the future costs to operate the system. So we'll look at the capital expenditures that are planned, both replacement of existing assets and growth-related assets. And then we'll look at how we can fund those assets, what reserves we can fund them from, is there grant funding available, development charges, etc. We also take a look at the future operating costs over the next 10 years. And so we will take a look at the existing operating costs and how they're going to change over the forecast. And then we also reviewed the existing rate structure. At the end, we put all the information together and we provide a forecast of new rates for the water and the wastewater systems. So there's some legislation related to water and wastewater, really since the Walkerton crisis back in 2000, where people were sick and some passed away from the water system. Part of the legislation that was brought in, and some pieces of legislation were brought in and they're enforced, some were repealed, but ultimately the principles of the legislation that are brought in really is to provide for full cost recovery of the system. So for the municipalities to ensure that we're allocating enough resources, we're allocating the expenditures required to ensure that we're maintaining and operating a safe drinking water system. In addition to those specific pieces of legislation, there's municipal infrastructure strategies and the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act, which is really requires municipalities to undertake asset management planning and provide a financial strategy for how they're going to replace the existing assets that they have. And so as part of this rate study, as part of the analysis, what we're really doing is looking at all the expenditures, the anticipated revenues required to pay for those expenditures to ensure that we're providing for full cost recovery of the assets and ensuring that we're properly planning for asset management. So with respect to the existing rates, the water and wastewater rates both have a base charge or that fixed charge per month, and that's tiered based on the size of your meter, and then a volumetric charge, which is imposed on a per cubic meter basis. And about 90% of municipalities across the province that have water and wastewater rates have some form of fixed or base charge structure with a volumetric rate. And so with Haldimand County, the way that we calculate these rates is we take the costs that are required to operate the system, and then we take 50% of that cost and we want to recover it from the base charge. 50% of that cost we recover from the volume charge. So in terms of the existing customers, on the water side, we have over 10,000 residential customers for a total of 11,439 water customers. And on the wastewater side, we have a total of 11,178 customers. And so this is important because the existing customers becomes the starting point for our calculations, and then we're going to layer on anticipated growth over the forecast. And so here on these schedules, what we show at the top for water is we look at the existing number of customers, 11,439, growing to about 14,793 customers by the end of the forecast. And in terms of the anticipated water volumes, we're looking at going from about 3.5 million cubic meters to just over 4 million cubic meters at the end of the 10-year period. For the wastewater system, we're looking at going from 11,178 customers up to about 14,532 customers by the end. And that correlates to 2.7 million cubic meters of volume in 2025, increasing to about 3.3 million cubic meters in volume by the end of the forecast period. And so as part of the rate calculation, as part of identifying the expenditures, we need to take a look at the capital projects or the capital needs over the next 10 years. And so working with the information provided by county staff, which identified the 10-year forecast of capital needs, we're able to identify them by the need, the timing, and identifying the specific costs, which I'll show a summary on the next slide. A large portion of the cost for the water program relates to a few projects, plant capital improvements, replacement of the elevated storage tank, and expansion of the Caledonia North water storage. On the wastewater side, about 58% of the capital spending relates to the Caledonia wastewater treatment plant. Next slide. So to summarize the capital needs we've identified over the next 10 years, we're looking at about $58.5 million in expenditures on the water side and just under $99 million on the wastewater side. Next slide, please. And so with respect to financing these capital projects, there's different ways that we can seek to fund this, and what we've identified is funding from reserve funds, so from the bank accounts, from development charges, so growth-related charges imposed on new development. We're looking at using debt to finance some of the projects, operating budget transfers, which is really taking the money from the rates and putting it into the bank accounts to fund those capital projects. And then we do have some other recoveries identified. And so with respect to the calculations, the starting point is the existing reserve fund balances. And so if we take a look at the water side in the development charge reserve fund, we have just over $900,000. So that's for growth related expenditures. We do have just under $48,000 for the Dunnville micro strainer reserve, so a specific reserve for that capital project. We have the rate stabilization reserve with about $2.44 million and a capital replacement reserve with just over $960,000. On the wastewater side, we have the capital replacement reserve with just under $13 million. But the development charge reserve fund is actually in a deficit about $13 million. And that is due to some expenditures over the last little while on the wastewater side related to growth related projects. And then we have about $3.62 million in the rate stabilization reserve. And so this table here breaks down how we're going to finance the overall $58.55 million on water and the $98.92 million on wastewater. And so you see we have some other recoveries from Norfolk in the amount of $623,000, some other recoveries of $3.9 million, funding from the development charge reserve fund for growth related projects of about $1.89 million, and then growth related debt, so debt that will be funded with development charges, just over $15 million. We have some funding from the Canada Community Building Fund Reserve Fund of $6.65 million, and then the rest, $30.4 million, comes from the Water Capital Replacement Reserve. On the wastewater side, we have $3.35 million from the Development Charge Reserve Fund, just under $67 million in growth-related debt, so again funded with development charges, and the residual $28.64 million coming from the Wastewater Capital Replacement Reserve Fund. So as part of this analysis, what we wanted to do is take a look at the asset management requirements. And so the county is currently updating the asset management inventory, but what we wanted to do was take a look at what other municipalities with similar characteristics, so similar kilometers of pipes, similar volumes of treated water, to see what the average annual life cycle requirements are. And then we can compare it to what the county's annual asset management expenditures are over the 10-year forecast period. And so when we looked at the average, water is about $6.5 million, average for wastewater is about $7.5 million. But when we look at the county's annual asset management expenditures over the forecast, it's about $4.8 million for water and $3.1 million for wastewater. And so the expenditures on the life cycle replacement may not be adequate to meet the requirements of your asset management inventory. And so as part of this analysis, we've utilized the information we have. And once the county updates the asset management inventory, it's anticipated that they'll review the annual life cycle requirement needs and review the rate requirements. In terms of the operating expenditures, the assumptions that are included in the analysis for water, for the City of Hamilton water purchases, so the county purchases water from the City of Hamilton. The City of Hamilton, through an agreement with the county, imposes a volumetric rate. And that volumetric rate is anticipated to increase 10% per year from 2026 to 2033, and then 2% in 2034. And so that's a significant share of the operating costs for the water system, which is driving some of the required increase for the rates. And so the cost of just the water purchases from the City of Hamilton is going from about 34% of the total operating expenditures today or in 2025. By the end of the forecast, it's going to represent about 46% or almost half of the total operating costs of the water system. On the wastewater side of things, the Caledonia Wastewater Treatment Plant, when that opens, it will have additional operating costs related to the chemicals, the staffing required to operate the plant, etc. And so as part of the analysis, once that plant opens in the subsequent year, we've identified an increase in those related operating expenditures. For hydro, utilities, materials, and chemicals, we've forecasted 5% increases, and for wages and salaries, 2% increases, and for other minor operating costs, they've been assumed to remain constant. And so what we can see here in this graph is the operating costs and the capital-related operating costs, which is really any transfers from the rates to the bank accounts to pay for the capital needs, any expenditures on debt that are related to capital. And so what you can see here is the capital-related component of the water budget remains relatively constant, but the operating costs increase over the forecast. And so the total costs that are imposed on the rates go from about $19 million today, or in 2026, up to just over $29 million in 2034. And a big driver of that is the increase in the purchase water rates from the City of Hamilton. On the wastewater side, it's a little bit different. We can see that the operating costs and the capital costs have a relatively similar share, but the capital costs become a larger share as we go over the forecast period. The total cost goes from about $12.26 million up to $19.9 million by the end of the forecast period. Next slide, please. Next slide. And so with all that information, putting it together, when we look at the water rates that are forecasted over the 10-year period, we're looking at, on the water bill, an average annual increase of about 5.5%. And so that base rate next year going up 4.89%, and the volume rate 5.7% for that 5.2% for next year on the water bill. And this is for an average residential customer that uses about 166 cubic meters a year. On the wastewater side of things, we're looking at annual average increases of 1.7%. And so next year, the base rate increasing that 2.3%, the volume rate 1.99%, for the total bill on the wastewater side going up about 2.18%. Next slide, please. And so when we put those together on the water and the wastewater side, the total estimated increase for next year is 3.69%, and the average over the next 10 years is 3.7% per year. And so when we compare to some of the neighboring municipalities and some other comparators, what we can see is when we identify that rate increase on the water and wastewater side, we're going from about a bill of about $1,092 today to $1,132 next year. And that puts you just slightly higher than Kitchener, still lower than Cambridge, St. Catharines, Brant County, and Norfolk County. Now keep in mind these rates for all the other municipalities are 2025 rates, and likely they will be looking at increasing their rates for next year as well. So we anticipate probably the same relative position to your comparators, even with these proposed increases. And so now to chat about the special charges. To provide a higher level of equity in calculating the water and wastewater rates, the county utilizes a number of special charges. And so on the water side, we have a fire protection charge and a bulk water rate. On the wastewater side, we have rates for septic holding and leachate. And so as part of this study and the analysis, these charges have been recalculated, and it's anticipated that every time, let's say 5 years or whatever the period is, the county decides to update the rate study, they would review these rates at that time. Next slide. So with respect to the fire protection charge, this is essentially an internal charge back to the fire department for the water used in fire services. And so because the fire service department provides service to the entire municipality, it represents this charge back so that it's recovered through property taxes. And so following principles set out in the American Water Works Association textbook on rate setting, and their recommendations, the costs related to the fire protection charge have been identified by looking at the operating and maintenance costs, the capital costs related to providing fire protection, and the life cycle costs related to those pipes and hydrants as well. The resultant calculations provide that if we look at the total system costs, the fire protection costs represent about 13% of that, and that's within the American Water Works Association recommended guidelines. Next slide, please. For the bulk water rate, this is a rate related to the sale of water at the bulk water depots in Dunnville, Hagersville, and Jarvis. And really the charge is to recover the costs related to providing the bulk water service. And so what we do is we take a look at the water treatment costs. And so we take the total water treatment costs, divide it by the total consumption in the system to come up with a per cubic meter charge for water treatment. Then we take a look at the bulk water depot costs, so the specific costs related to the bulk water depot, divide it by the volume assumed for the bulk water depot, and that's the share of the distribution costs, so the pipes, and then the life cycle costs related to the specific assets for the depot. Then we take off some administrative revenue that's anticipated to come up with the overall per cubic meter rate. And the current rate is $3.53, and the calculated rate is $2.74. And the decrease in the rate is due to the increase in the volumes relative to the increase in the costs. And so because the volumes are the denominator of the calculation, when we increase the denominator, the overall rate per cubic meter goes down. With respect to the wastewater charges for the septic holding charge, this is related to the waste from septic and holding tanks, as they have a larger impact on the system. And so the charge is utilized to recover the costs associated with these specific volumes. And so what we do is we take a look at the total septic holding costs, so the costs related to this activity, divided by the total volumes to come up with the rate. And the costs related to this activity, what we do is we take a look at the life cycle costs for the infrastructure, the specific equipment required for the septic or holding flows, and we include a proportionate share of the life cycle costs for any shared equipment. Then we add in the proportionate share of the overall wastewater treatment operating and capital costs, weighted by the relative concentration, to come up with the total costs. Subtract some administrative revenue, and that's how we allocate the cost related specifically to septic holding. And so the current rate in 2025 is $16.88 per cubic meter, and that's anticipated to increase to $18.95 per cubic meter. And this rate increase is in part due to the readdition of a life cycle costing, so the replacement cost, full asset management cost of assets at the receiving station in Dunnville. And as well, we're seeing a decrease in the overall volumes. And so again, if the denominator decreases, then the rate will increase. With respect to the leachate charge, again, this is a special charge that's applied to the solid waste service as the leachate or runoff from the landfill needs to be treated at the wastewater plant. And so what we're looking at here is a fixed charge and a volume charge. And so we take the total costs that need to be recovered. 50% of those costs are a fixed charge, and 50% of the costs are a volume charge. So we take the 50% of the costs divided by the total anticipated volumes to come up with that volume rate. And again, similar to the septic and holding charge, to estimate the total costs of the leachate service, we take the annual life cycle costs of the specific equipment required for leachate, plus a proportionate share of the shared equipment, as well as the proportionate share of the overall wastewater treatment operating and capital costs, again weighted by the concentration ratio for leachate. And so the current rate for 2025 is $724,000 plus $19.54 per cubic meter, and for next year increasing to $802,518 plus the $19.56 per cubic meter. And with that concludes my presentation. Happy to answer any questions.